Recently, the scientific journal Reviews on Environmental Health published a set of guidelines for diagnosing and treating electromagnetic sensitivity. Electromagnetic sensitivity is a disorder in which patients experience a wide array of symptoms when exposed to cell phones or Wi-Fi signals, things like that. This is a really serious issue considering that anywhere from 0 to 0 people experience electromagnetic sensitivity every day, sometimes as many as 0. There's a lot of skepticism over the supposed dangers of Wi-Fi for a number of reasons. Chief among them is probably the fact that every major, large-scale, well-funded, peer-reviewed study looking at the connection between human health and radio frequency fields has found absolutely no connection. There have been smaller studies that suggest that long-term users of cell phones may have an increased risk of brain cancer, but those studies aren't very rigorous, and the effect is so small that it's just slightly above what we would expect to see from chance. Also, as cell phone use has exploded in the past few decades, we have not seen any comparable increase in the number of brain cancer cases. All of this hasn't stopped people from claiming that cell phones and Wi-Fi signals make them feel nauseated or listless or dizzy or superpowered like the Incredible Hulk. Wait, nope, that was gamma radiation, which is ionized, unlike radio frequency, which is non-ionized, meaning that it's not powerful enough to strip electrons from atoms. So you'd think that based on all of that scientific evidence, that any scientific journal addressing how to diagnose and treat quote-unquote Wi-Fi sickness or electromagnetic sensitivity would do so under the understanding that it's most likely a psychological issue and not an environmental issue. However, the Reviews on Environmental Health claimed that, and I quote, "There's strong evidence that long-term exposure to certain EMF exposures is a risk factor for diseases such as certain cancers, Alzheimer's disease, and male infertility." And then they go on to recommend that Wi-Fi be removed from most public places like libraries and schools and hospitals. Not only did they fail to conduct or cite any new convincing evidence to support these claims, but the entire paper has now been retracted. Not for being completely frivolous, but for being almost wholly plagiarized from an earlier report that has already been debunked. The 2012 Bioinitiative report, from which this new report was plagiarized, was a giant mishmash of cobbled together nonsense produced by dozens of different contributors, some of whom were scientists. And this report assumed that any previous study that showed any effect from electromagnetic radiation, regardless of how small the effect was or how poorly done the study was, they assumed that that was relevant and that it should be used to set guidelines. For instance, it references a study from the year 2000 that found that tiny worms exposed to radio frequencies would produce heat shock proteins, despite the fact that this study was later on retracted because they didn't control for heat. Radio frequencies actually do just raise the heat in the environment. And so this study and many others that have looked at radio frequencies didn't take that into consideration and just assumed it was the frequencies interacting with the cells in the worms that caused these proteins to be released. There is so much more negative stuff to be said for that Bioinitiative report, but I just don't have the time. So if you head on over to my Patreon page, I've included a link to a thorough debunking that was published in Science-Based Medicine when it first came out. So how did this new report in Reviews on Environmental Health get past peer review when it was so clearly plagiarized from a well-debunked previous report? Well, that's because the journal admitted that they didn't bother to do any peer review at all. Ta-da! So to sum up, you're probably not in any danger from Wi-Fi, but you are in danger of trusting too heavily in scientific journals that claim they do peer review, but skip it when they just don't think it's necessary.